Hello everyone and welcome back to Panic Peak. Let me know where you are listening from in the world by leaving a comment, and if you like the episode, please like and subscribe. Now, let's get cozy, and let's begin. Every town has its traditions, its myths, and its secrets. For Hollow's End, the Hollow Parade is all three. It's a celebration, a performance, and, if you believe the oldest families, a ritual. From the time we're old enough to walk, we're told it's an honor to witness the parade, a privilege to participate. But no one ever talks about what lies beneath the masks and music, or why the floats seem darker, more menacing, with each passing year. Every year on Founding Day, our small town becomes a spectacle of color and music. The Hollow Parade winds its way through the streets, floats brimming with handcrafted decorations and performers in elaborate costumes. It's a tradition older than anyone alive, meant to honor the founding of Hollow's End and, supposedly, keep misfortune at bay. This year felt different. The air was thick with a humid stillness, the kind that makes you feel like you're being watched. As I made my way to the town square, I noticed the floats. Gone were the familiar depictions of golden fields and smiling pioneers. Instead, dark, jagged structures loomed above the crowd, their shapes twisting unnaturally. The paint on them glistened like fresh blood, and faint whispers seemed to emanate from their surfaces. The parade began as usual, marching bands, dancers, and performers weaving through the streets. But the people in costumes, their faces obscured by grotesque masks, wouldn't speak. They didn't wave or acknowledge the cheering crowd. Instead, they moved with a mechanical precision, their heads tilted as if listening to something only they could hear. When I asked one of them, a masked figure with antlers twisting skyward, who designed the floats, they turned to me. Their voice was soft, almost reverent. "The debt must be paid." A chill ran down my spine. Debt? I asked what they meant, but they stepped back into the parade without another word. As the procession wound its way to the square, I noticed the onlookers' expressions shift. Smiles faded, replaced by vacant stares. Some whispered under their breath, their voices blending with the strange hum that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. I thought about leaving, but my curiosity rooted me in place. When the final float arrived, the crowd fell silent. It was massive, a towering structure that scraped the tops of the trees. Unlike the others, this one was covered in a shimmering black veil. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as the veil was slowly drawn back to reveal a mirror, a giant, obsidian mirror. It reflected not the parade, nor the crowd, but a barren, desolate landscape under a blood-red sky. I felt a pull, a magnetic force dragging my gaze into the mirror. My surroundings faded, and I saw them. Shadowy figures with hollow eyes and elongated limbs, standing in the barren landscape. Their mouths moved in unison, though no sound came. One by one, the figures stepped through the mirror. The crowd didn't run or scream. They knelt. I was the only one still standing, frozen in place as the figures moved among the people. One stopped before me, tilting its head. Its hollow eyes bored into mine, and I understood. The debt was our lives, our souls, offered to these beings in exchange for prosperity and safety. For centuries, the town had paid it willingly. This year, I was the balance. The shadow extended a hand, and I felt my body move against my will. My fingers touched its own, and an icy pain shot through me. My vision blurred, my limbs turned heavy, and as I collapsed to my knees, I felt the parade move past me. My voice joined the whispers, my body nothing more than another hollow shell in their procession. Days later, I awoke in darkness. The air was thick and cold, and I could feel the weight of stone pressing down on me. Slowly, I realized I wasn't alone. Around me, other figures stirred, their movements jerky and unnatural. We were in a cavern, its walls shimmering faintly with a strange, phosphorescent light. The shadowy figures from the mirror were there, standing in a circle, chanting words that seemed to resonate deep in my bones. I tried to scream, but no sound came. My body no longer obeyed me. I moved when they willed it, knelt when they commanded. The other figures, once townspeople, I realized, were the same. Their hollow eyes mirrored my own. In the center of the cavern stood the mirror, its surface rippling like water. Through it, I saw the town. It looked unchanged, untouched, as if nothing had happened. People went about their lives, smiling, laughing, oblivious to the truth beneath their feet. The chanting grew louder, a crescendo that made the cavern tremble. The mirror's surface shimmered, and I saw the parade again. The floats, the masks, the whispers. It wasn't over. It would never be over. Each year, the debt would be collected. Each year, more would join us in this hollow existence. And I would be there, a silent watcher, a prisoner of the hollow parade, forever. Hollow's End continued to thrive, its fields fertile and its skies calm. The townsfolk celebrated Founding Day year after year, their laughter masking the dark truth. They never questioned why the hollow parade grew darker, why the whispers lingered longer in the air. The price of prosperity was hidden, buried deep beneath their feet. In the cavern, we waited. Our hollow forms moved in rhythm with the whispers, our voices a faint echo of the living world. The mirror remained our tether, showing us glimpses of the town above, a cruel reminder of the lives we once had. But even in the hollow darkness, a spark remained. I began to wonder if the cycle could be broken, if the debt could ever be repaid in full. The others seemed resigned, but I felt something stir within me, a fragment of defiance, a faint memory of who I was. Perhaps the hollow parade would not last forever. Perhaps, one day, the debt would be paid, or denied. Until then, I watched, whispered, and waited, dreaming of a time when the chains would break and the hollow parade would march no more. They say some places are born wrong, their very existence a tear in the fabric of the world. The Mirror Orchard is one such place. Nestled deep in the hills, it's a grove of metallic trees whose strange allure has drawn the curious, the desperate, and the unwary for generations. The townsfolk speak of it in hushed tones, their warnings tinged with fear and reverence. Some believe the orchard reflects the truth of who you are. Others whisper of those who return changed, strangers in their own skin. No one leaves unmarked. The first time I saw the Mirror Orchard, its metallic leaves shimmered under the pale light of dawn. It wasn't the kind of beauty you'd call inviting, more like a warning cloaked in allure. The branches swayed unnaturally, as though the orchard had a rhythm of its own, a silent song that called to anyone who dared approach. I'd heard the stories, of course. Everyone in town had. The orchard reflects your inner self, they said, but stay too long, and you'll lose yourself entirely. I told myself it was just folklore, a tale spun to keep curious wanderers at bay. But when the dreams started, vivid, insistent dreams of the orchard calling my name, I couldn't resist any longer. I had to see it for myself. The journey there was uneventful, the kind that makes you question why you're afraid at all. But the moment I stepped into the orchard, the air changed. It was heavier, charged, like a storm was about to break. I walked between the trees, their polished surfaces reflecting me back in perfect detail. Too perfect. It wasn't just my face staring back, it was my emotions, my fears, my secrets. I saw glimpses of things I'd rather forget, arguments I'd lost, lies I'd told, dreams I'd abandoned. And then I saw something worse. A figure, just out of sight, darting between the trees. It looked like me, but not quite. The movements were off, jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being yanked by invisible strings. I called out, but my voice sounded strange in the dense air, like it was swallowed before it could carry. The figure turned, and I froze. Its face was mine, but its eyes were hollow, dark voids that seemed to pull everything into them. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, but the orchard wouldn't let me go. Every direction I turned, I saw the figure again, closer this time, mimicking my every move. I ran, branches slicing at my arms, but no matter how fast I went, I couldn't escape the reflections. They were everywhere, multiplying, each one more distorted than the last. Some smiled cruelly, others wept, all of them seemed to blame me for something I couldn't understand. Finally, I collapsed at the base of a massive tree, its trunk smooth as glass. I looked into it, desperate to find something, anything that wasn't a twisted version of myself. But the reflection staring back was worse than all the others. It wasn't angry or sad or cruel. It was empty. Utterly void of anything human. And as I watched, it reached out, its hand breaching the surface of the tree as if it were water. I screamed and tried to move, but my body wouldn't obey. The hand gripped my wrist, cold and unyielding, and pulled me in. When I woke up, I was back in my bed. At first, I thought it had all been a dream. But then I noticed the changes. My reflection in the mirror didn't follow my movements perfectly anymore. Sometimes it lingered, staring at me with an expression I didn't feel. People in town looked at me differently too, their smiles forced, their eyes wary. My own mother flinched when I spoke, as if my voice didn't match the person she knew. Now, weeks later, I understand the stories weren't warnings. They were promises. The orchard doesn't just reflect who you are, it takes you, piece by piece, until there's nothing left but the hollow shell it leaves behind. I don't know how much of me is still real, how much longer I'll even recognize myself. But the dreams have started again, and this time, they're not calling me back to the orchard. They're calling something else out. And I'm terrified to find out what. The changes were subtle at first. The way shadows seemed to linger a beat too long when I passed. The way my reflection in glass windows would catch my eye, not out of vanity but because it moved just a fraction slower than I did. I'd stop to stare, to test it. My hand would rise, the reflections would follow, but there was a hesitation, a glitch I couldn't ignore. My mother stopped speaking to me altogether. She'd make excuses, she was tired, or busy, but I knew the truth. She didn't know who I was anymore. I didn't blame her. Sometimes I didn't know either. One night, unable to sleep, I wandered outside. The town was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that feels alive. My feet carried me toward the hills without conscious thought. It wasn't until I stood at the edge of the orchard that I realized where I was. The metallic leaves shimmered under the moonlight, their surfaces catching and twisting the light in ways that made my head ache. It was as though the orchard was waiting for me, its silent song louder than ever. I wanted to turn back. I wanted to run. But I couldn't. My legs moved on their own, carrying me into the heart of the orchard. The trees seemed taller this time, their branches weaving together to form a canopy that blocked out the sky. The air was thick, oppressive, and the reflections, they were worse. They didn't just mimic me anymore. They moved independently, stepping out of the trees and into the path. They circled me, their hollow eyes watching, their distorted faces shifting with emotions I couldn't name. Some wept, others laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. One reached out, its hand brushing my arm. It was cold, and the touch sent a jolt through me, like static electricity. I tried to pull away, but it held firm. "Why did you come back?" it asked, its voice a warped echo of my own. "I didn't mean to," I whispered, though even as I said it, I wasn't sure it was true. The figure tilted its head, studying me. "You can't leave," it said. "Not this time." The others closed in, their laughter rising, their voices overlapping in a cacophony that made my head throb. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it all to stop, but when I opened them, I wasn't in the orchard anymore. I was somewhere else entirely. The sky was a dark, swirling mass, and the ground beneath my feet was cold and metallic. The reflections surrounded me, no longer distorted but perfect replicas. They stared, unblinking, and I realized with a sinking dread that I wasn't the original anymore. I was one of them. The real me was gone, swallowed by the orchard. And the worst part? I didn't even remember what it felt like to be whole. Days turned to weeks, and I found myself slipping further into this existence. The replicas around me were silent companions, their faces mirroring my growing despair. I wandered the dark expanse endlessly, searching for a way out, but the orchard had no exits. Time felt meaningless here, each moment stretching into an eternity. One day, I came across a reflection that was different. It wasn't a copy of me, but someone else, a young girl, her eyes wide with terror. She stood frozen, her lips moving soundlessly. I reached out to her, and for the first time, I felt warmth, a flicker of humanity that I thought I'd lost. She pulled away, her form dissolving like mist, and I realized she must have been a newcomer to the orchard. Someone who still had a chance to leave. That's when it hit me, the orchard didn't just trap people, it fed on them. It thrived on our fears, our regrets, our weaknesses. And it wasn't just taking from me, it was using me. I was no longer its victim, I was its lure. Now, as I stand at the edge of the grove, I see them, silhouettes in the distance, drawn by the same whispers that brought me here. They don't see me yet, but they will. And when they do, I'll be the reflection they can't look away from, the promise of answers they won't find. I am no longer afraid of the orchard. Because now, I am the orchard. I always thought of myself as a man of routine, steady, predictable, like the quiet hum of the town itself. But sometimes, routines get disrupted by things we never saw coming. The day the census official arrived, that was the day everything changed. I didn't know it at the time, of course. None of us did. We thought he was just another government worker, one of those faceless people who come through every few years to check on the town. We never thought to question why he was different. Why the records he carried were filled with names we couldn't remember. The sun had barely risen when he appeared, standing at the edge of the square, his dark coat billowing around him like the shadow of something much larger. His name was Mr. Harrow, though I didn't know it then. Not at first. But I would learn it soon enough. I'd learn everything in time. What started as an ordinary visit, a simple request for information, quickly spiraled into something much darker. Something that we couldn't escape, no matter how hard we tried. You see, Mr. Harrow didn't just ask questions. He took things we didn't even know we had to lose. It all started with my name. I can barely remember it now. Can you remember yours? It was early when I first saw him standing in the town square, just a silhouette in the gray morning light. I'd been on my usual walk, the same route I took every day, the one that led down by the lake and past the old church. The streets were still empty, but there he was, standing like a shadow beneath the crooked street lamp, as though he had been there for much longer than I had noticed. I wasn't sure if I should stop. I wasn't sure if he'd even seen me, but something made me pause. Maybe it was the way he looked so out of place, like he didn't belong, Or maybe it was the odd feeling that crept into my chest when I realized he was watching me. I should have turned around then, walked away, but my feet were heavy. I couldn't move. Eventually, he spoke. "Good morning," he said, his voice cold, but smooth, like polished stone. I managed a half-hearted greeting, my words barely escaping my throat. He didn't seem put off by my lack of enthusiasm. He smiled, though it didn't seem warm. It was more like a greeting, polite but distant. "I'm here for the census," he said, as though that explained everything. The census. I hadn't thought about it in years. The last one had been, well, it didn't matter. I barely remembered filling out the forms. Still, there was something about the way he spoke that didn't sit right with me. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" I asked. "I don't remember anyone telling us about a census." His smile never wavered. "That's why I'm here," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "To ask a few questions. It won't take long." I didn't have the energy to argue, so I nodded and followed him to the town hall. It was a small building, just a room with a few tables and folding chairs, but it served its purpose. I hadn't expected it to be the setting for what would become the longest, most surreal day of my life. Once inside, Mr. Harrow set down his leather briefcase and opened it with deliberate care. He pulled out a yellowed ledger, its pages crinkled and torn at the edges, like it had been passed from hand to hand over many years. His fingers lingered on the first page, as though he were reading something I couldn't see. "Robert Wilson," he said, reading from the book. "Born in 1973, correct?" I froze. My heart thudded in my chest. "How do you know that?" He didn't answer, just motioned for me to sit. As I did, I noticed something unsettling. I couldn't remember when I had last heard my own name. It felt like it belonged to someone else, like a label slapped on me that I had no claim to. My mind was suddenly foggy, like I had just woken up from a long, strange dream. "Tell me, Mr. Wilson," Harrow continued, his voice steady and low, "how long have you lived in this town?" I tried to answer, but my words seemed to drift away before they fully left my lips. "All my life," I said, though even I wasn't sure if it was true. He nodded slowly, as if expecting that answer. His pen scratched on the paper, marking my response. It felt like the room was growing smaller, as though the walls were slowly closing in on me, pressing down on my chest, and I couldn't breathe. He asked more questions, questions about my family, my childhood, my house. The more he asked, the more I began to feel like I was watching someone else's life. It was as if my memories were no longer mine to keep. I struggled to remember the answers, but they slipped away like water through my fingers. "Do you recall when your father passed away?" Harrow asked, his voice turning darker. The question hit me harder than I expected. My father, had I ever known him? The face that flickered in my mind seemed blurred, distorted, like a half-formed image I could barely grasp. It was the strangest sensation, this inability to remember the man who had raised me. Was he even real? Had I made him up? I hesitated, feeling the weight of his gaze on me. I don't know," I muttered, my voice trembling. Harrow scribbled something in his notebook. "No matter," he said, not looking up. "You've been very helpful, Mr. Wilson. I'll see you again soon." I stood up, the room spinning as I stumbled toward the door. His words echoed in my mind, but they felt distant, unimportant. My name, Robert Wilson, felt strange in my mouth, like I had forgotten its meaning the moment it left my lips. Outside, the town looked unchanged, but something was off. People passed me on the street, but when I tried to wave, they didn't look at me, not really. Faces were familiar but distant. And when I tried to speak to them, I couldn't recall their names. Not a single one. I found Clara at the bakery, her flour-dusted apron just as it always was. But when I approached her, her face seemed different, somehow. Like I was seeing her for the first time. "Good morning, Robert," she said, her voice soft but strained. "How are you today?" For a moment, I couldn't answer. The words felt foreign on my tongue. Robert? Was that really my name? "Robert," she repeated, her eyes narrowing. "That's your name, right?" I nodded slowly, though doubt crept into my chest. "Yes," I whispered, though it sounded wrong. Like someone else's voice. And then, I noticed something else. Clara's eyes, once warm, now seemed distant. She didn't seem to recognize me at all. "Have we met before?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her words sent a chill through me. Something was happening. Something I couldn't understand. People were forgetting. Their faces blurred. Their memories faded. And it wasn't just me, everyone in town was being erased. Piece by piece, we were all slipping away, our identities dissolved like sugar in water. I wandered through the streets, feeling more lost with every step. I searched for my house, but when I tried to recall where it was, the memory vanished like smoke. Faces I once knew, neighbors, friends, strangers, began to fade. And when I called out their names, they stared at me blankly, as though they'd never heard them before. I found myself back at the square, but Mr. Harrow was waiting there. As though he'd been expecting me. "Mr. Wilson," he said, his voice smooth, like ice sliding over glass. "It's time for the final question." I didn't ask what that meant. I couldn't. My mind was unraveling too quickly. "Do you remember why you're here?" Harrow asked, his voice so calm it felt like a lullaby. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words were gone. My memories had vanished. My name was a ghost. My life was a blur. I didn't even know who I was anymore. I swallowed, feeling the hollow emptiness that had taken root inside me. "No," I whispered. Harrow smiled then. Not kindly, but knowingly. Just as I thought. And with that smile, everything faded. The town, my memories, my very self, everything dissolved, and I was left with nothing but a blank void. Somewhere, far away, a name whispered on the wind. Robert Wilson. But it was already forgotten. The town still stands, or at least, what's left of it. But no one remembers who we were. Not even our names. And Mr. Harrow? He's still here. You just won't recognize him. Or yourself. Not anymore. Now, as I stand here, or rather, wherever I stand, if standing is even the right word, I can feel the emptiness pressing in. It's been days, or maybe weeks. Time doesn't matter anymore. The place I once called home is nothing but a faint impression, a fading echo in the corner of my mind. I remember the sensation of slipping away, my existence unraveling, piece by piece. The faces that once filled my life now flowed in front of me like ghosts. And somewhere, deep within me, I know I've forgotten something important, something I was supposed to hold on to. But I can't recall what it is. I walk through the remnants of the town, its crumbling buildings like forgotten monuments to a life no one remembers. The air is thick with the weight of the forgotten. Every step I take feels like a search for something, anything, that can anchor me to a past that no longer exists. But it's gone. All of it. Every face. Every name. Even mine. And somewhere in the distance, I hear Mr. Harrow's voice again, whispering on the wind. Do you remember who you are? But I don't. And soon, I won't even remember this. Not even a question. None of us will. It began as a rumor, like all things do in small towns. Whispers in the streets, behind closed doors, about the mayor's sudden disappearance. Mayor Phelps had been missing for months, without a trace. No signs of struggle, no ransom demands, he had simply vanished. And though the town had carried on in his absence, there was an undeniable shift in the air. People spoke less, moved slower, and even the sky seemed to have lost its vibrance. Curiosity had always been my vice, but this was different. The more I heard about the mayor's disappearance, the more I felt a strange pull, a feeling I couldn't shake. Something had happened to him, something not of this world. It was when I heard that they had found his diary in the library that I knew I had to find out for myself. I had been in the library countless times, but this time, it was different. The dust of forgotten history hung in the air, and the faint creak of the old wooden floors seemed to echo my every step as I made my way to the mayor's desk. What I found there would change everything. The diary was old, its leather cover worn, the pages yellowed with time. I hesitated for only a moment before opening it. But what I read there sent shivers down my spine. The mayor had known something dark, something hidden just beyond the veil of the forest. And now, it was coming for me. March 3 RD. The town has always lived with a shadow hanging over it, but today, I felt the weight of it more than ever. The whispers in the woods, the strange lights at night. I can't shake the feeling that something is out there, watching us. I walked to the edge of the forest today. For the first time, I saw it. Just beyond the trees, there's another town. A reflection, but not a reflection. Its buildings look familiar, yet they twist and warp, like something from a nightmare. I can hear their voices, but they don't speak my language. March 5 th. I returned to the woods today, unable to stop myself. I crossed the line that separates the two towns, or at least, I thought I did. What I found on the other side was both impossible and terrifying. The town is not the same. The people look like us, but their eyes, there's something wrong with their eyes. I can't describe it. They smile in a way that feels unnatural. No one acknowledges me, but I can feel them watching. There's a sense of hunger in the air, like they're waiting for something, or someone. March 9th. I don't know how much longer I can stay here. I've been back to the other town every day. The border is thin, and once you pass it, you can't quite tell if you've returned or not. The other town is darker, older, like it's been here far longer than we've known. And the people, they have been following me. I see them in the corners of my eyes, standing in the streets, just out of view. I think they want me to stay. They've said as much in their quiet whispers. Stay with us. They said it as I passed through. It's all I can hear in my dreams now. March 12th. I tried to leave again today. But I found that I was no longer where I thought I was. The trees, they grow differently now. The paths that used to be clear are twisted. The sun feels wrong. I thought I was back in the town. I really did. But the people here, they don't recognize me. I've tried to ask them for help, but they just stare, as if I'm some kind of stranger, as if they're all waiting for something, waiting for me to understand. March 15th. I found the border again today. It wasn't where it should have been. The road that I thought led home took me deeper into the other town. The buildings are the same, yet different. I'm trapped between the two worlds. I can feel their presence now, closing in on me. They want me to stay. They keep asking me to stay. But I can't. I need to get back. I need to warn the others. This town, our town, is not safe. It never was. March 20th. I'm not sure I'll make it out. The people, if they can even be called people, are closing in on me. They know I'm trying to leave. They don't want me to warn anyone. I've seen their faces in the windows, their eyes peering out, watching. I can hear their whispers in the night, "Come to us. Stay." I don't know what they are. I don't know how to escape. But I know one thing, if I don't leave soon, I'll become like them. One of them. I stopped reading then, my hands trembling, the words blurred before my eyes. I had to find him. I had to go into the forest and end this nightmare before it reached the others. But when I looked out the library window, the trees stood still, silent as ever. And that's when I heard it, a low hum, barely perceptible at first, but growing louder. It came from the direction of the forest. The whispers from the diary began to echo in my mind. Stay with us. I knew then that the mayor wasn't missing. He had been lost to the other town, just like everyone else who had dared cross the line. They were all waiting for me now. They wanted me to join them. It was too late to turn back. The storm had been brewing all afternoon, clouds gathering in dark, swirling masses above the town. By the time night fell, the rain began to pour in sheets, relentless and unforgiving. I had been in town to visit an old friend, someone I hadn't seen in years. But with the storm intensifying and the streets emptying, I felt a strange pull, a whisper in my ear, an urge to explore that I couldn't explain. I had heard the stories, of course. Everyone in town knew about the Phantom Fairgrounds. It was one of those things people spoke of in hushed voices, as if saying too much might summon something worse than the storm itself. A forgotten carnival, tucked away on the outskirts, that came to life only when the weather turned violent. And those who dared venture near spoke of strange attractions, twisted versions of the past, of fears and regrets. But no one ever spoke of it for long, as if the mere mention could make you part of the horror. I had dismissed it as local folklore, nothing more than a tale to scare children or fuel drunken conversation. But when I found myself standing at the gates, rain dripping from the brim of my hat and the wind howling around me, I realized that I wasn't sure if it had been my curiosity that led me here, or something darker. Something that had been waiting. The gates creaked open on their own, as if they had been expecting me. At first, I hesitated, my instincts urging me to turn back, to leave the unsettling sight behind me and head home to the warmth of my friend's house. But something about the storm, about the way the air hummed with electricity, kept me rooted in place. The wind whipped at my face, and I shivered, but it wasn't from the cold. There was something in the air, something that tingled at the back of my mind, something that dared me to take a step forward. I crossed the threshold. The fairground stretched out before me in eerie silence, the flickering lights of rusted rides casting long, distorted shadows. The abandoned booths stood like skeletons in the mist, their once bright colors now muted by years of neglect. Yet, despite the obvious decay, there was an unnatural vitality in the air, an energy that pulsed in the dampness of the ground beneath my feet. It was as if the fairground was waking up after a long sleep, but it was the kind of awakening that didn't promise joy. It promised something darker, something hungry. I wasn't alone. A few others had gathered near the entrance, their figures shrouded in the mist, as if the storm had drawn them here as well. Their faces were indistinct, shadowed under their hoods, but their eyes, wide, almost frantic, met mine. No one spoke. There was no sound except for the storm itself, the distant rumble of thunder and the soft whisper of the wind through the overgrown grass. It was as if we were all waiting for something to begin. Without a word, we all began to move, drawn to the attractions ahead. It was impossible to resist, and I couldn't help but follow, my legs carrying me toward the rusted Ferris wheel that loomed like a phantom from the past. It creaked in the wind, its metal frame rattling as if it had been waiting for years to turn once more. The air grew colder, and the rain started to fall harder, drenching me within moments. I wiped the water from my face and looked up at the Ferris wheel, the distant glint of something shiny caught in the wind. My stomach twisted. The ride was not supposed to be moving. It hadn't moved in decades. And yet, there it was, slowly creaking to life. "Step right up." A voice echoed from nowhere, distorted by the storm, the sound reverberating through the air like a dream or a nightmare. It was deep, gravelly, like it came from the earth itself. "Face your fear." I turned to the others, trying to make sense of what was happening, but they were already moving forward, drawn to the ride as if in a trance. I felt my heart pound as I followed, unable to resist. The Ferris wheel creaked again, its rusted seats swaying in the wind. I climbed into one of the seats, heart hammering in my chest. As soon as I sat down, the wheel groaned and jolted to life. The air around me crackled with an otherworldly tension, the wind howling and the storm intensifying with every moment. The seat beneath me was damp, cold against my skin. I clenched my hands around the bars, my fingers numb from the chill. And then the world shifted. The wheel slowly rose into the air, but something was wrong. The ground below began to twist, bending and warping like a distorted dream. I saw flashes, quick glimpses, of faces I knew. My parents, their expressions twisted in terror. Their mouths moved, but no sound came. I reached for them, but the mist swallowed them whole. I gasped, my breath catching in my throat as the landscape shifted again. I was a child again, standing in front of my burning childhood home, unable to move, unable to help. The flames leapt higher, their heat searing my skin, even though I was miles away from the fire. The heat burned in my chest, a weight I couldn't shake, as I watched the building crumble to ash. My mother's voice echoed through my head. "You could have saved us." I closed my eyes, squeezing them tight, trying to banish the images. But they lingered, clawing at me, forcing me to confront my guilt, my regret. I wanted to scream, but no sound came from my mouth. The Ferris wheel creaked again, and the visions shifted once more, pulling me deeper into the darkness. The wheel reached the top, and I saw a reflection of myself, older, broken, standing in the rain, drenched to the bone, hands trembling as I reached out. I could feel the cold creeping into my soul, the weight of every failure, every decision I couldn't undo. A voice, my voice, echoed around me, low and mocking. "You should have never come." I recoiled, panic rising in my chest. I was choking on my own fear, drowning in it. My chest tightened, and the ride jerked violently. I was falling. I reached out, grasping at the bars, but they slipped from my hands, my body hurtling downward into the abyss. But then, everything stopped. The Ferris wheel halted, and I was jerked back into the seat. The world around me twisted and bent, the mist thickening, consuming everything. I was surrounded by darkness, yet I could hear the whispers. Voices, everywhere, surrounding me, pressing in from every side. "They never leave," one whispered. "No one ever leaves." I tried to scream, to fight, but the fairground had taken hold of me. The gates I had passed through were no longer visible, and the others were gone, vanished without a trace, as if they had never been there at all. The ground beneath me seemed to shift and pulse like a living thing. The mist curled around my feet, and I realized, with a deep, cold dread, that I was not alone. I wasn't just lost in the fairground. I was part of it now. The voice that had once mocked me echoed one last time, the words curling into my very soul. Not everyone makes it out. And as the storm raged on, I understood. Some fears were not meant to be faced. Some places were never meant to be found. And now, I was trapped, forever, in the phantom fairgrounds. A prisoner to my own regrets and the dark, insatiable force that had awakened with the storm. The town of Sandwell had always been small, quiet, and serene. Nestled between rolling hills and dense woods, it seemed as if nothing could disturb the peaceful rhythm of our lives. For generations, we had relied on the well at the center of town, a deep, ancient source of water that had never failed us. As children, we played around it, our laughter echoing through the quiet streets, and as adults, we took solace in its constant flow, never questioning how it came to be or where it went. But that was before the water started to dry up. At first, it was barely noticeable, a slight drop in the water level, a slow, unsettling decline. But soon enough, the well was nothing more than a pit of cracked earth. The once pristine water, which had quenched the thirst of generations, began to fade into a memory. The crops withered, livestock grew sick, and our once thriving town began to wither alongside the well. Whispers of drought turned into desperate discussions. The farmers spoke of their fields turning to dust, of wells in the surrounding villages drying up faster than they could pump. The town meeting was filled with murmurs of disbelief. There were no natural disasters to explain it, no change in the seasons, no reasons we could grasp. It was simply happening, our lifeblood, the water, was running out. The elders spoke of a time long past when the well had been constructed, before our memory. They had always warned us not to tamper with it, to respect its ancient power, but those warnings had faded with the years. As children, we had heard stories of the well's origins, tales of a bargain struck with forces we dared not understand. But we had dismissed them as nothing more than folklore. In a meeting held at the town hall, our leaders announced a plan to investigate the well. We would descend into its depths, find the cause of the drought, and fix it. But none of us knew then that our search would uncover something much darker, something that would forever change Sandwell. The decision was made. A small group of us, including myself, would go down into the well. We gathered the necessary equipment, ropes, torches, and enough supplies to last us the descent. The townsfolk looked on as we prepared to face the unknown, their faces twisted with equal parts fear and hope. They believed, as I did, that if we could fix the well, we could restore Sandwell to its former state. They didn't understand what had been broken in the first place. The rope was lowered into the darkness, and one by one, we climbed down. The first thing that struck me was the temperature. The air was thick and damp, but there was something unnatural about it, something oppressive that clung to our skin as we descended. We were almost halfway down when I noticed the walls of the well were unlike anything I had seen before. The stones were smooth, worn by time, but there were strange markings, symbols carved into the surface. They were subtle, almost hidden, and I almost thought they were just the result of weathering, but then I realized they weren't. They were deliberate, intentional. I called out to the others, but the sound of my voice was swallowed by the vast emptiness. It felt as though we were descending into something more than just a well. It was as if we were falling into the heart of something old, something forgotten. We reached the bottom, and that's when I saw it. At first, it was just a faint glow, a dim light emanating from beneath the earth. But as I stepped closer, I could see the full extent of what had been hidden there. The floor of the well was covered in strange, intricate carvings, far more detailed than anything on the walls. They formed a massive circle, surrounded by jagged lines and smaller symbols, figures entwined with one another in unnatural positions. At the center of the circle was a figure that made my blood run cold. It was an ancient being, humanoid in form, but its features were distorted, twisted, eyes that seemed to move, its mouth opened in an eternal scream. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest, and I heard the others arrive behind me, their footsteps faltering when they saw what I had found. "This isn't right," one of the men, Thomas, said. His voice trembled as his eyes scanned the carvings, which seemed to pulse with an eerie life of their own. "These symbols, they don't belong here. They shouldn't be here." I knelt down, running my fingers over the carvings, and felt a shock of cold run through my fingertips. It was as if the stones themselves were alive, reacting to my touch. I traced the symbol in the center, and something shifted in the air. The hum of the place grew louder, vibrating through the walls, the floor, the very ground beneath my feet. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, my voice shaking. The others nodded, though none of us dared speak again. We knew it wasn't just the wind or the sound of the earth shifting. It was something else, something far older. A voice, deep and guttural, whispered through my mind. "You have broken the pact." I jerked away, breathless, as the others looked at me in confusion. I tried to shake off the sensation, but the words echoed in my mind. I staggered back, tripping over the rough stone floor as a sudden, icy cold gripped my body. The well seemed to close in on us, the shadows growing darker, deeper, as if the walls themselves were drawing closer, suffocating us. The symbols on the floor began to shift, forming new shapes, new patterns. The glow intensified, and the air grew thick, stifling. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. My hands trembled as I looked around, realizing too late what had happened. The carvings were not just a warning. They were a seal. A seal to keep something down. And we had broken it. I turned to the others, my eyes wild with panic, but it was too late. They were staring at the symbols, their faces blank, almost hypnotized. Their mouths were moving, though no sound escaped, as if they were speaking to something unseen. Their eyes began to change, pupils narrowing into slits as their skin grew pale and drawn. It was like they were being taken, pulled into the very fabric of the well itself. I stumbled backward, my heart racing as the darkness around me began to twist and shape into something monstrous. The air vibrated with a deep, resonant growl, like the rumble of a creature awakening from a long, slumbering rage. The well was alive. The carvings, the symbols, the hum, they had been waiting. Waiting for us. I turned and ran. My legs felt like lead, each step a struggle as I scrambled toward the rope. But the walls were closing in. The ground trembled beneath my feet, and I heard a voice, not in my mind, but in the air itself, as if the earth were speaking. The price must be paid. I reached the rope, but before I could climb it, a force, cold, brutal, slammed into me. I was dragged backward, the air pulled from my lungs, and I gasped in terror as something enormous, something ancient, rose from the depths of the well. Eyes, dozens of eyes, opened in the darkness, glowing red, watching me, judging me. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the feeling of something ancient, terrible, and hungry closing around me, swallowing me whole. When I awoke, I was lying at the edge of the well. The others were gone. The well had stopped flowing completely, but the carvings were no longer there. The stones were smooth, unmarred by the symbols I had seen just moments before. But I knew the truth. The bargain had been broken. And whatever had come for us was still out there, waiting for the price to be paid in full. I could still hear it, the whisper in the back of my mind, promising that it would return. The price is never truly paid, only postponed. I've been trying to remember who I am, but the harder I try, the more everything slips away. At first, it was subtle, little things, like forgetting where I left my keys or mixing up someone's name. But now, it's like I'm being erased. And it all started the day the new family moved into town. They were strange from the start, quiet, distant, never sharing their last name when people asked. It didn't seem like much at first, just an oddity in a town full of ordinary lives. But soon after they arrived, something began to shift. At first, no one really noticed. But then I realized, people started forgetting things. Small things at first, birthdays, anniversaries, but then it grew. People's names. Their faces. The very essence of who they were. Now, I can't remember my own name. And the worst part is, I'm not sure if I ever really had one. The new family, they have something to do with it, I'm sure. They've come to take everything. And there's nothing left but silence. It started slowly, like a creeping fog. The first person I noticed was Mrs. Willis, the librarian. I'd seen her almost every day for years, her small frame hunched over as she carefully alphabetized the books, muttering under her breath about one thing or another. She was a fixture in this town. Everyone knew her. Or, at least, I thought we did. I walked into the library one afternoon, eager to check out a new book I'd been waiting for, and she didn't greet me like usual. Instead, she just stared at me as I approached the desk. "Can I help you?" she asked in a voice that sounded like it was coming from a long distance away. I blinked, confused. Yeah, it's me, Sarah. You know, from the book club." She didn't react, her face smooth and expressionless. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" The words hit me like a slap. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a cold tremor run through me. "It's Sarah. You know me." I stopped myself, struggling to recall details. My mind felt hazy, like I was reaching for something that wasn't there. She blinked, her eyes glassy, before shaking her head slowly. "I'm sorry. I don't remember you." I turned, quickly leaving the library, my breath shallow. Something was wrong, something terribly wrong. As I stood on the steps of the library, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out, desperate to make sense of what had just happened, but when I opened my contacts, the list was empty. All the names, all the numbers I'd spent years collecting, they were gone. My own number. Gone. I tried not to panic. Maybe it was just a glitch, a mistake. But deep down, I knew this was no accident. Over the next few days, the changes spread like wildfire. People began to forget each other in ways that seemed impossible. I walked down Main Street and watched as strangers passed by, but it was more than just unfamiliar faces. It was the way they looked at me, like they knew me, but at the same time, didn't. Like I was a shadow, flickering at the edges of their memory, too indistinct to grasp. I ran into Peter at the cafe. Peter had been my neighbor for 5 years. We'd shared countless conversations, from trivial gossip to deep discussions about our hopes for the future. He was the closest thing I had to a best friend here. "Peter, hey," I said, smiling as I approached him at the counter. He looked up, his expression blank. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice flat. I froze, my stomach twisting. "It's me, Sarah. Your neighbor. We live across from each other." He blinked, but there was no recognition in his eyes. "Sorry, I don't know you." I stood there, the words stuck in my throat. He didn't remember me. I could see it in the way he looked at me like I was a stranger. Panic surged through me. "Peter, no, this isn't right. What's happening to us? To the town? But Peter didn't respond. He just turned away and went back to his coffee, as though I was a ghost, already fading from his memory. The days blurred together after that. Each morning, I'd wake up and try to remind myself who I was, but nothing seemed to stick. The harder I tried, the more I felt like I was slipping through my own fingers, a ghost trapped in my own skin. It was then that I noticed something even more terrifying. No one in town seemed to have a last name anymore. At the town hall, I tried to request a copy of my birth certificate, anything to prove I existed in the way I remembered. But the clerk, a woman I'd known for years, didn't even look at me when I asked. She simply handed me a blank form, her face vacant. When I asked her why, she blinked and said, "I don't know. There's no record of your name here." I thought I was losing my mind. That's when I saw them, the new family. They had been here for a few weeks now, just beyond the edge of town. No one seemed to know their last name, but I had caught glimpses of them: the father, a tall, thin man with hollow eyes; the mother, a woman whose face was always half shadowed by her dark hair; and the child, a girl no older than 10, who never smiled. I'd heard whispers that they were different, that they never went into town or interacted with anyone. But more and more, I found myself drawn to them, like a moth to a flame. Something about them felt wrong. One night, I couldn't sleep. Something pulled at me, and I found myself walking toward their house. It was on the outskirts of town, a small, ramshackle house surrounded by overgrown grass. I had never been this close before, but something about the night, the air, felt charged with something ominous. I approached the house slowly, my footsteps heavy. As I neared the front door, I saw the family standing on the porch, staring at me. "You shouldn't have come," the man said, his voice eerily calm. I froze, my heart pounding. Why? What's happening to us? To everyone? The woman stepped forward, her face cold and unreadable. "You're forgetting who you are. Who we are." The girl, standing silently beside them, lifted her head to meet my eyes. But her gaze was empty, like she was looking straight through me. "You're all becoming nothing," the man continued, his voice barely a whisper now. "And it's too late to stop it." Suddenly, it hit me. The truth, crashing into my mind like a wave. They were the ones erasing us. They had come to take our names, our identities, and soon, our very existence. They had come to erase the town, to erase everything we had ever been, until nothing was left but silence. I turned and ran, but even as I fled, I knew it was already too late. The town was slipping away, fading into the distance. And soon, I would be gone too. I am no one now. And there is no one left to remember me. I don't know how much time has passed since that night. The days blend together in a haze, each one feeling like the last, like the world is unraveling and there's nothing I can do to stop it. I tried to return to the town square the next morning, hoping against hope that things might somehow go back to normal, that I could find someone who remembered me. But the town was empty. The streets, once full of life, now lay silent. The buildings, familiar yet distorted, seemed to flicker in and out of existence. There was nothing left but an eerie stillness that filled the air, suffocating every corner of this place. I walked for hours, calling out for someone, anyone. But the only response was the sound of my own voice, echoing back at me in a cruel reminder that no one was listening. It wasn't just the people. The town itself seemed to be eroding, dissolving into the same nothingness we were all becoming. The roads were fading. The houses, the shops, all of it. It felt like we were being slowly erased from the world itself. I went back to the library, hoping to find something that might explain it all. The doors were unlocked, and inside, I found Mrs. Willis, if you could still call her that, sitting at the desk, her eyes staring blankly ahead. She looked up when I approached, but there was no recognition in her eyes, no memory of who I was or who she had been. It was like I was speaking to a stranger wearing her face. "Do you remember anything?" I asked, my voice trembling. Her lips parted, but all that came out was a soft, indecipherable murmur, as if she were trapped in a dream. I looked around at the empty shelves, at the records that no longer seemed to exist, and realized something else: there was no record of anything. Not the books, not the people, not the town. It was as if everything had never been. I left the library and wandered toward the outskirts of town, toward the house of the family that had started all of this. The one that had come to take our names, our very existence. I didn't expect them to be there. There was no reason to believe they even existed outside my fragmented memories, but something compelled me to search for them one last time. I reached the house, or what was left of it. The overgrown grass was gone, replaced by a barren, lifeless ground. The house itself had vanished, as though it had never been built. But there, standing in the empty lot, was the girl. She was staring at me, her face expressionless. I could see her clearly now, as if a fog had lifted from my mind. She looked like she was waiting for something. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I had to know. I had to understand what was happening. The girl tilted her head slightly, and for the first time, I thought I saw a flicker of something in her eyes, an understanding, a kind of knowledge. "You don't need to remember," she said softly, her voice like a fading echo. "It's better this way. You're already gone." I wanted to scream, to ask more, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I felt the weight of an overwhelming silence press down on me, suffocating. It was like the very air around me was thinning, becoming harder to breathe. And then it hit me, like a final wave crashing over me: I had already been forgotten. Not just by the people around me, but by the world itself. I was nothing more than a memory that was never meant to exist in the first place. I turned away from the girl, the last remaining piece of this town, and I knew in my heart that there was no going back. I was no longer Sarah. I was no longer anyone. And soon, no one would remember that we were ever here at all. The town, my town, was gone. Forgotten. Erased. And so was I. I had always known there was something off about the town, something hidden beneath the surface that everyone tried so hard to ignore. It was in the way the houses were spaced just too far apart, how the air felt too still on warm nights, and how the streets seemed to hold their breath whenever anyone tried to speak of the past. But it wasn't until the crops began to fail that I realized how much darkness had already taken root. The farmers had noticed it first: their fields, once bountiful and golden, turned brown and barren overnight. No one could explain it. No one even tried. It was as though the earth itself had stopped caring. The first whispers of it appeared in the local tavern, half-finished mugs of ale abandoned on tables, hushed voices trailing off when newcomers entered. "It's the curse," they said. "A bad omen from the land itself." The elders spoke as though they knew more, their faces clouded with dread, but no one dared ask them for details. In the town, the rule was simple: don't ask too many questions. And when questions were asked, the answers were vague, as if the truth might be too heavy to bear. We all thought it was some kind of bad omen, a sign that something terrible was about to happen. But even as the rest of the fields withered and died, one field, just beyond the woods, remained untouched. The crops there grew lush and unnaturally vibrant, despite the absence of sunlight. Every day, I would pass by it on my way into town, my gaze drawn to the dark, twisting vines and impossibly bright vegetables. The sight filled me with a strange unease, like the creeping sense of dread just before a storm. Yet I couldn't look away. The produce in that field wasn't like anything I had ever seen, its colors were too sharp, too intense. The greens of the leaves seemed almost too vivid. The vegetables themselves looked unnaturally smooth, their skins glistening as if they were coated in some kind of sweet syrup. And still, no one dared to touch it. No one even spoke of it. But that's not what confused me the most. What really unsettled me was the fact that the field grew despite the lack of sunlight. The farmers said it was impossible, no crop could thrive in perpetual twilight, but the evidence was right there, in front of us all. The plants grew and bore fruit, but there was a stillness about them, an eerie silence that hung in the air. But there was one thing I couldn't shake, a gnawing hunger inside me. Not just for food, but for something more. It was like the field was calling to me, pulling me closer with every passing day. I'd hear the whispers, faint and distant at first, telling me to come. Just taste it, the voice seemed to say. You'll see. It'll fill the emptiness. And I listened. Despite the warnings, despite the fear that churned in my gut, I decided to go. One night, when the moon hung low and heavy in the sky, I snuck away from the house and walked toward the field. The woods were thick with shadows as I passed through, each tree looming over me like a silent sentinel. The air was still, too still, and my own breathing seemed to echo in the quiet night. As I reached the edge of the field, the first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't the smell of fresh earth or damp soil, but something sweeter, almost sickeningly so. The breeze carried the scent of fruit, overripe, heavy, and intoxicating. My stomach growled, and for a moment, I forgot my hesitation. I stepped into the field. The ground was warm beneath my feet, too warm for a late autumn night. The earth was soft and almost spongy, as though something was alive beneath the surface. I walked deeper into the field, drawn by the unnatural beauty of the crops. I could feel the air growing thicker, pressing in around me. It was almost as if the field were breathing, exhaling its secrets into the night. At the center of the field, I found the vegetables, the ones everyone had whispered about. They were perfect. A cluster of tomatoes, so bright and red that they seemed to glow, their skin translucent, pulsing with an eerie light. Carrots that shimmered with a faint green glow. Strange fruits, shaped like nothing I had ever seen, nestled in the branches of twisted vines. Everything in that field thrived without light, without reason. And yet, it felt wrong. But the hunger, the pull, was too strong. Without thinking, I reached down and plucked the ripest tomato from the vine. Its skin tore easily under my fingers, revealing the sweet, thick juice within. I brought it to my lips, the fruit's scent almost overwhelming as I took a bite. It was unlike anything I had ever tasted, a rush of sweetness, so rich it almost choked me. It filled me with warmth, a deep, satisfying heat that spread through my veins. For a moment, I thought nothing of the darkness in the air, the unnatural stillness of the place. I ate more, another tomato, then a carrot, then a handful of the strange fruits, their skin crisp and cool. But as I chewed, I felt it, the emptiness. A coldness that crept in from the edges of my body, sinking into my chest, my limbs. My breath quickened, then slowed. I looked around, and the world seemed to tilt, as if the ground itself were shifting beneath me. I stumbled backward, a chill rushing through my body. The warmth from the food was gone, replaced by a hollow ache that gnawed at my insides. The field around me began to warp, the edges stretching impossibly far, pulling at my very perception of reality. I could no longer feel my body properly, my fingers were numb, my legs stiff. It felt as though my very essence was being pulled away, emptied, drained. Panic surged in my chest, but the more I tried to move, the more I felt paralyzed. The shadows around me lengthened, curling like tendrils that reached toward me, pulling me into their dark embrace. The field, it wasn't just a field. It was alive. And it had already claimed me. My heart hammered in my chest, but I could no longer feel its pulse. It was as if my entire body was being hollowed out, my thoughts growing distant, muffled. I tried to scream, but no sound came. The world around me faded to a dull blur, the colors of the field slipping away like water from my fingers. The hunger remained, but it was no longer the hunger of the flesh. It was something deeper, darker, something that gnawed at the very core of who I was. I couldn't remember how long I stood there, rooted to the spot, trapped by the very soil I had once thought to escape. And then I understood, the field didn't just grow crops. It grew souls. It fed on the living, hollowing them out, turning them into empty shells. The people who had come before me, the ones who ate the fruit and vanished, were not gone. They were here, with me, lost and wandering in the field, forever. The last thing I remember before the darkness swallowed me whole was the faint whisper of something calling my name, from the earth beneath me. Now, I am just another husk, trapped between the vines and the shadows. I cannot leave. No one can. And the field, it is still waiting. Waiting for the next one to come and taste its forbidden fruits. I never believed in ghosts, spirits, or anything that couldn't be explained. I was a journalist, after all, rational, skeptical, always looking for the truth behind the stories. So when I was assigned to cover the local graveyard's mysterious allure, I figured it would be just another quaint, if not slightly strange, piece for my column. I had heard the rumors, of course, the ones about the fog, the warmth, and the strange pull it seemed to have over people, but they were just that, rumors. Local superstition dressed up as history. But now, as I stand here, I realize that I was wrong. So terribly wrong. I thought I understood the world. I thought I understood myself. But I was wrong about the graveyard. And more importantly, I was wrong about what it meant to stay. It's too late to leave now. It's too late for me. And I can already feel the fog closing in, dragging me deeper into its secrets. It started innocently enough, with a foggy morning that had become typical in the weeks leading up to the story. The air was thick, almost palpable, as if it were a living thing, heavy with moisture. I arrived early, just as the sun was struggling to break through the mist. The town's graveyard sat at the edge of the village, surrounded by rusted iron gates and towering oak trees, their branches like gnarled hands reaching into the sky. As I approached, the fog seemed to embrace me, wrapping itself around my shoulders and pressing in against my chest. It wasn't cold, though. In fact, there was a warmth to the air that struck me as odd. The graveyard itself had an eerie stillness to it, as though the fog had swallowed all the sounds, leaving only the muffled thumping of my heartbeat. I took out my camera and began snapping photos of the tombstones, focusing on their intricate carvings, names and dates now worn away by time, the faces of long-forgotten souls barely visible. The old headstones, many of them leaning or cracked, stood like silent sentinels, watching over the forgotten dead. There was something strange about the air, too. It wasn't just the warmth, it was a sweetness, faint but unmistakable. At first, I thought it might be the scent of damp earth or decaying leaves, but it lingered too long, too thick in the air. Almost like honey, but wrong. Too sweet. I couldn't quite place it. A few minutes passed, and the fog deepened. I barely noticed when the graveyard grew emptier. The few locals who had come to visit their loved ones seemed to have vanished. It was just me now, surrounded by gravestones and silence. That was when I saw her. She was standing at the far corner of the graveyard, near the oldest section, where the graves were so weathered it was impossible to make out the names. She wore a dark shawl that covered most of her face, but I could still make out the stark outline of her pale hands resting on a tombstone. She didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence. At first, I thought she might be one of the locals, but something about her posture seemed wrong. Too still, too rigid. I called out, but she didn't respond. "Excuse me," I shouted, trying to shake off the odd feeling crawling up my spine. No response. I took a step forward, my curiosity piqued, but a sudden unease held me back. Something in the air felt thicker. The warmth around me became stifling, and I had to pause to catch my breath. I glanced back toward the old woman, but she was gone, vanished into the mist as if she had never been there at all. I shook my head, telling myself it was nothing. Just my imagination, nothing more. I turned to walk deeper into the graveyard, still determined to finish my story. But that's when the fog grew heavier, thicker, until I could barely see the tips of my shoes. And then I felt it. A sudden pull in my chest, an unnatural tug that seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath me. My feet, on their own, began to move forward, drawn toward the center of the graveyard. The temperature was now unnervingly warm, yet the fog pressed against my skin like it was trying to suffocate me. I stopped, my breath coming out in short bursts. It wasn't just the mist that seemed to press in now. The air was different. A faint, sweet fragrance lingered. The same smell I had noticed earlier, but now it was overwhelming, intoxicating. I found myself inhaling deeply, the scent pulling me in deeper. That was when I first heard the voice. "Stay." It was low, soft, almost a whisper, but it echoed in my mind like a command. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, my body fighting against the unnatural urge to move forward. I shook my head, forcing my legs to stop, trying to convince myself to leave. I took one step back, then another, but it was like my feet were sinking into the ground itself. A strange dizziness crept into my thoughts, clouding my judgment. "Stay with us," the voice whispered again, only this time it wasn't just in my mind. It was everywhere. I turned and saw that the fog had thickened, filling the space around me. The gravestones blurred into shapes, shadows reaching toward me. The woman from earlier stood there again, but this time, she was closer, her figure now fully visible, her pale face drawn and hollow, her eyes staring straight into mine, unblinking. "Help me," I tried to speak, but the words felt hollow. The fog was pressing in on me from all sides, suffocating me, and the sweet, sickly scent filled my lungs, making me dizzy. I struggled for air, but there was no escape. No sound of my own breath, just the heavy pressure in my chest. The woman reached out, her hand pale, fingers long and cold, but instead of recoiling, I found myself reaching toward her, as though her touch would ease the burning in my chest. She smiled, a thin, knowing grin. "You'll stay now," she said softly. "We all do." I stumbled backward, my head spinning. I didn't want to stay. I couldn't stay. But my legs wouldn't listen. They carried me forward, deeper into the fog, to the center of the graveyard. The warm air clung to my skin, the sweet fragrance wrapping itself around me, binding me to this place. I tried to fight it, but the pull was too strong. My vision blurred, and the world around me seemed to spin. Then, I felt it. My feet sank into the earth. My skin tingled as though it were being covered with something thick, something alive. My breath came out in shallow gasps, and I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. The fog wrapped itself around me, and the last thing I saw was the woman's smile, warm and knowing. "I told you," she whispered, just before the fog swallowed me whole. "You'll stay." I don't know how long I've been here now. The fog never lifts, the warmth never fades. I hear others whispering, others who, like me, once sought answers, but now they are part of the graveyard. Part of its endless embrace. And I am, too. I am here forever, bound by the breath of the graveyard, drawn in by the sweet air, by the pull that claims us all.